So, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me. Let me know if you can hear me. I am going to be using a little of oxygen during our chat, but the oxygen machine is next door, so you shouldn't be able to hear it. Let me have a look if you can hear me. Live chat. Paul saying that I am audible. So we're going to just have a personal chat. You can ask me anything you like about me, how I am doing mentally or physically, but I'd rather focus on you. So I really thought this would be perhaps a shorter than usual and smaller than usual get together where we only ask personal questions about politics. There can be personal questions about anything else too, but let's say personal questions mostly about politics. And I want to do that really because there's the sense that people are really freaking out, that the political world feels traumatic and discombobulating, and that the changes are happening so quickly that they're hard to get used to. Hello, Cheryl. Hello, Matthias. Hello, everybody. So let's take a little look at how we're doing and see where we are. Shadow Guy, I won't answer a political question today, but I would love to answer it another time. I just want to focus on personal questions. So pay attention to that little announcement at the top where I say only personal questions. Oh, but no, you're not asking that. You're asking a personal question. So it's because my brain is dead that I'm unable to read. So did I personally have a freak out about Brexit? And do you know that Switzerland didn't join the EU because of a referendum? The government wanted to join. Well, let me tell you about my experience of Brexit. So I tend to not freak out about politics because my psychology as a philosopher makes me very historically minded. And so I'm always comparing our situation to the situation of the past rather than the recent past. And I think that psychically, that's one of the big differences between people who are freaking out and people who are freaking out less. If you have a very sort of recent sense of comparison, then what's happening now is really bad and scary. I mean, we've half lost Article 5 in a matter of weeks. But if you are comparing it to the last 100 or 200 years of Western or European history, then this is still relatively fair sailing. You see, it's less good. It's much less predictable. It's more volatile, but it's relatively fair sailing. The downside is that the trajectory is negative. So where I'm going with this, I haven't forgotten the question, is that by 2016, when the referendum in the UK happened, the trajectory of democratic decline was already pretty clear. Having said this, I predicted Trump's victory over Hillary in the sense that I was talking about Trump winning, and I thought it'd be close, but I expected Trump to win. I didn't expect Brexit to go against Remain. I thought it was a coin toss edging toward Remain. So I misread that a little bit. So that's an interesting discrepancy. Moreover, I favored Remain strongly, and I did so for two reasons, really. One is that my skepticism of the European Union as a project that has a rosy future doesn't translate into opposition to the European Union. It just translates into realism about its incapacity. And then secondly, I thought that even if you favored Brexit, the people who were offering to deliver it were just chances who couldn't deliver it even if they wanted to. So it was a sort of an offer that was kind of actually unavailable to an entirely rationally reconstructed Brexiteer position, because there was a kind of a discrepancy between the aspiration and the delivery mechanism that wasn't suitable to it. So because of that, I was very, very strongly Remain. And I voted late. My health was better then. I voted late. I voted at about 11 in the evening. And then I got back and I looked at the bookies, and the odds were getting smaller and smaller and smaller for the Brexit side to win. So I opened a bottle of champagne to wake up the next morning, of course, to a Brexit victory and the realization that I had lost. But you see, at that point already, I had the sense that there was a global momentum of democratic destabilization. And that's why what was striking for me was the timing of it, that it was happening at that point already, not that it was happening. So that was kind of my emotional response. I would say it was mild because I understood the trend we were in, but it was not nothing because I felt that it signified that a certain period of history was over. And you see, I am somebody who thinks that the period of history between the late 90s and about 2010 is quite special in historical terms, a specially privileged period, and also a period in the West where many of the benefits of the internet were already here without the scary downsides that we're encountering today. That's a little bit of my Brexit experience. Mick, I have an episode on immigration on on this channel, on the chat channel, and I'd love to talk about it more, but I want to focus towards something more um, emotional. If you want me to talk about fears and concerns about the immigration issue, I can. But in a nutshell, yes. I mean, the far right will have immigration as its central issue for the decades to come, and immigration as an issue will become more important than it is today for several reasons. One of them being the climate crisis, just going to generate far more people movement than what we've seen so far. How do you switch off from politics? How do we get away from circuitous conversation in the pub and talk about something else? So it's very personal. I'm a freak in the sense that politics doesn't get me down. So it's not right for me to go on about myself in this regard because it's just not a useful model for 99% of the population, right? I mean, I am just not somebody who is in any way flattened by politics, because politics is something that's almost professional for me. Well, it is really through philosophy. And that means that politics is about love. And that means it's about love however it goes, love for human beings as they are, not just as I would wish them to be, as they actually are. So my love for humans is, in a way, at the center of my reaction to the political world. And sort of emotions of misanthropy or loathing human beings because they're forever starting wars and doing famines. Well, I don't feel like that. I can get outraged about something very bad being done, but I don't have any kind of depletion around the idea that humans are awful. So because of that, that's okay for me. What I generally recommend is an exploratory sense of your own buffers, so that you don't put into yourself more than you can tolerate. And it depends on you, right? If you are lactose intolerant, you shouldn't really put any milk products inside you. If you're lactose tolerant, you can have some cheese, maybe, but again, not too much. Well, what's too much for you? So it's about, I think, a lot of self-love when things are wonky in the outside world around what you expose yourself to, right? And it's also about watching out for thoughts that sort of put you into a more compulsive relationship with the consumption of political news. Like, well, if I don't pay attention, maybe it means that I don't care, or maybe it means I'm not engaged enough. But um, if you're ever engaging and it feels not good, stop. Just stop. Politics is not something you should ever try to force down your throat. So that's one thing. Now, there is also something else, and that's that I really care about this issue, but I'm really worked up about it, and I just can't stop myself digging in to whatever is going on in the news cycle about it. And here, I think some discipline can be important, which just says, look, I know it's hard to stop, so what kind of mechanisms can I put in place to get myself to stop? And that means being online in a more minimal way, not looking at certain websites. Or maybe it means, going offline. Or maybe it means looking online at a certain time and just doing it on your time, right? One of the worst things to do is to consume the news on the time of the news. Unless you're a professional journalist, you don't need to do that. So I'm going in circles because I'm a bit brain dead, but the reality is that I think buffers and self-love are very important. A self-love that leads to a kind of exploration of what and when is okay to put into you and what is not good anymore and too much. Do you worry that Trump will decide out of the blue not to pay dividends on US Treasury bonds, crashing the world economy and destroying the emotionally, my immediate reaction to Trump is that Trump is very narcissistic. And there is a video that's coming out about how Trump's narcissism feeds into his adoration of Putin on the main channel, health allowing, hopefully, maybe in 2 days. And what's really important about that video for me is that it links psychology with society-wide political issues, which we rarely do. We often think about psychology as something that's to do with managing personal relationships, and political experts don't think about psychology much. So that's what I like about that video. It'll be beyond the issue of just Trump submitting to Putin. But I think when we talk about Trump's narcissism, it's very important that there isn't an I there when he looks into himself. And that means that he has no project except the project of theatricity. That makes him unpredictable. Throw in some ADHD into that, and the contrarianness and impulsivity of ADHD not so well managed, combined with narcissism, and you have a large capacity for erratic behavior. Having said this, that's still better than having a psychopath with a predictable, consistent, dogged project of fascization. That's not Trump. Some people around him are a bit in that direction, but Trump himself isn't. So my basic emotion about Trump is that he will be followed by people who are worse than him. So if you're asking for my emotional response is I hope that people realize that we're warming up at the moment and that we're going to have worse and more doggedly committed Trumps in the 2030s. So that's my attitude to him. I think that we are coming out of the bay into open ocean, but we aren't in the open. We're out of the bay now. You can feel that. It feels really scary. It doesn't even make sense because we're supposed to be anchored in the bay, but we're still not out in the open water. We're still surrounded by sort of the outer islands of the island group we are exiting from. So it'll get more bumpy. And so my entire sort of emotional direction there is really toward the thought that democracies are highly likely to survive the first wave of authoritarian populism, but how will they do with the second wave? So that's my feeling. So no, I don't have absolutely catastrophic thoughts about Trump, but I do think that all kinds of risks are elevated, including the risk of nuclear war. But I don't think we should be catastrophically minded about that at this stage. When I talk to my friends about democratic decline, their common reaction is, it sounds nice, but we can't do anything about it. How should I reply to them? Well, you know, it might be right for them to stay out of politics. It depends on who they are, right? They might be a reclusive artist. But if that's not quite right for them, in your opinion, then the answer is, look, if you don't try to inflect the political process, it will inflect you. And so what you say to somebody like that potentially is, look, historically we've been in a privileged bubble in which it most likely isn't going to touch you if you're 80% of the population very dramatically, who wins which election. But we're reaching an age now where that's not going to be the case, where one party winning is going to make a difference, not just to some groups here and there, but to most people in society, right? Because if you have a political project that threatens the freedom of the courts or the freedom of the press, it's going to affect everybody. So we're transitioning out of a stage in which you could basically pretend that it doesn't matter, right? I mean, Rishi Sunak was my prime minister before. Keir Starmer is my prime minister now. Now, the reason I don't go out and have a coffee is because of my health condition. But the truth is that I could just as well go out and have a coffee if I could, and it'd look roughly the same. I'd see the same people on the street. So it's this distinction, right? How far are we moving into an age in which actually who wins an election is going to have a visceral and palpable effect that you're going to notice fairly quickly as you go about your life. Suzanne, apologies if this has been asked. Just tuned in. As an American, I don't know how I navigate watching people in my government giving Nazi salutes. As an empath and student of history, I'm distraught. So, Suzanne, you may need to indulge me because I am planning a video on this. I actually planned the video straight away on Musk, but I didn't do it because I wanted one of those videos, not one of those videos. So I will do it. And now we have Bannon. So I think that the clarity of the act is there with Bannon. It's actually not there with Musk, contrary to the liberal establishment's mistaken opinion. But I want to talk about both. And I also want to talk about an interesting detail here, which you could see with Bannon, which is the post-truth gesture. It's the gesture where you do and don't do the gesture, but you intentionally do and don't do. That's a very interesting part of post-truth politics too. The way you think about it in broad terms is, yes, you have a group now that is out to attack one or two counter-majoritarian institutions, in particular the civil service. And the question is, how effective are they going to be at that? And what will that mean? Um, you know, uh, by the time the next few moments of moment in American democracy arise, the next few elections, um, is something going to be changed that's going to make an irrevocable difference to the U.S. polity. You could think about the sustenance of democracy like the compartments in the Titanic. A few can flood and you can still keep going easily. But you can't have 5 or 6 flood. You can have 2 or 3. So we're very much in the early stages of compartment flooding. So I suppose the thought is to understand that this is a long game and that nothing is going to happen tomorrow is going to break your democracy. In terms of being distraught, this is a new direction for us, right? We're coming out of the bay, and we have to respect that trauma and shock are a process in time, right? I mean, there are some things that happen in life that you never even begin to get over, like losing a child. But there are other things like losses of friends who pass, or breakups, um, you know, that lead us to be in a kind of worked up physiological state for a while. And we always talk about this sort of 18-month period before we begin to find our equilibrium again. And it's very important, I think, that being shocked by what's happening just has to be, for your body, a process in time that you can't accelerate. You can't cheat time like that. You just have to go with it. And I think a lot of the physiological shock that people are feeling, it's an 18 to 24-month enterprise before people find a way to settling down a bit and dancing a bit more pliantly and in a less traumatized way with the reality around them. Because one of the things that's sort of really hard to process is that this is a combination of things going badly and things not making sense. And that's what's really shocking, because you're meant to be in the bay and then suddenly you're drifting to open ocean. It's not meant to happen. It's like many years ago, I was doing a sleepover in the bay in little island group in Tonga, and it was in an anchored yacht, and there was a storm, and the yacht next to me got taken out into the ocean, de-anchored and taken out into the ocean. Folks were sleeping; they ended up being okay. But that's the shock. It's just we were meant to be sleeping here in the bay, and then woof, where is our anchor? Why are we floating out into the sea? What the hell is happening? So, you know, uh, when that happens to your democracy, it is a physiological process in time to react. And it does mean that means there's got to be a lot more gentleness and self-care for an 18, 24-month period as we adjust to a new historical moment. That's the shock of a transition period. And we have to be generous to ourselves here, the way we would be if we were going through a personal trauma too. John, how do you understand acceptance? How do you understand versus acceptance, radicalization? So are you asking me the difference between acceptance and radicalization, or understanding the world versus accepting it or being radicalized? But let's try it all ways. Now, acceptance is something that's all about openness and receptivity, and receptivity to the possibility of being surprised as well. So it's always about pliancy, flexibility, dance, exploration, faith in relation to an uncertain scenario you're negotiating. That means that it's natural to think of acceptance and refusal to accept as things that don't just clash but can dance together. There's such a thing as balancing acceptance with refusal to accept. And when things don't make sense that happen, because they're so senselessly bad, you can balance acceptance with refusal to accept as well. So there can be a kind of a dance there. I'm not sure how far it's possible to understand without feeling like you're part of it, because what you're trying to understand is politics as a citizen, and understanding politics is always understanding something to which you kind of belong, even if it's scary and polarized and alienating. And then in terms of radicalization, just make sure that your radicalization isn't a depoliticized radicalization, isn't a giving up on cause and effect in politics, isn't about giving up on institutions without which you can't get anything done in the end, as flawed as they might be. So there is, if you like, realistic radicalization, if you like, um, um, you know, something that you could actually call radical realism, um, or realist radicalism. And then there is the kind of radicalism that's about, floating away from reality. And then, of course, there is such a thing as understanding that there can actually be certain ways of asking a question that increase the chances that you're actually going to disengage rather than engage with the question. So, for instance, if I sit here and say, "Why is my democracy declining? Why is it declining?" Or why am I so fat? Why am I so fat? Why am I so fat? Well, that's not going to encourage me to eat fewer donuts. Um, so there are also ways of neurotically engaging with questions that are in fact ways of avoiding them. Martin. Do you think that if the Alternative for Germany eventually achieved victory in German elections, that would be the final nail in the coffin for the EU? I don't believe in final nails in the coffin. I think what we're going to see for the European Union is a kind of slow decline through incapacitation. So it's not that the European Union is going to collapse, it's that it's going to become more and more um, incoherent. There are going to be more signals that are sent but not registered or received. There is going to be more exceptionalism, things happening that shouldn't be happening, like the Orban phenomena. And it's going to be a sort of process of the European Union ceasing to sustain and maintain its own rules, if you like, rather than a collapse. So it's going to be a kind of a running aground into the mud, and then progressively the wheels will just spin without anything moving. That's the sort of analogy for EU dysfunction. It's not a sort of collapse via some kind of revolutionary termination of the project. Sorry, that was too politically analytical. Let's have a look. And I'm taking super thanks, but I also just want to jump into general questions in a second. I'm being a bit slow, perhaps. How should we think about and interact with people who are deeply invested in a political ideology that we believe is immoral and destructive? Well, sometimes if you don't have the bandwidth, don't interact with them. If they are in your life, don't try to persuade people. Understand that the only things that motivate people are the things that already motivate them. That's a very Humean point, that to change somebody's mind, you need to make not a good argument, but appeal to something that's inside them that is already compelling for them, is already compelling, probably not at the level of an argument, but the level of some kind of image or metaphor. If you are going to try to persuade or debate, try to do it from a position of intimacy. So you have to throw 5 intimacy coins into the relationship. Let's have a beer together. Let's discuss how your dog is doing. Let's discuss how you're doing emotionally about your amazing fishing trip last year. Let's talk about, how you're feeling about the local affairs in our town. Not very politically. And then we can raise a political issue about, Donald Trump. But it has to be a sort of a ratio of 5-1. So you've got to be careful. And then another important rule is, of course, never raise a political issue when there is no space for it, when it's not going to go anywhere. So always think, what result am I going to achieve with this? So the sort of the analogy for this is the way we talk about couples, not, and this is something I learned actually in my personal life only about 10 years ago. So up until my mid 30s, I didn't consistently follow this rule, but that's the rule that you don't go anywhere in your personal relationship, in your family, unless there is space to go there, right? So if you're taking the kids to school at 7:43 in the morning, and you're walking around in the kitchen with your partner, and your partner raises an issue, and you feel you have 3 important complaints about it, but everything is in motion and nobody's ready to receive anything, of course you can't raise it then. You're actually gonna sort of deplete your own case here if you raise it at the wrong time. So there is also that, right? That sometimes it's just not the right time to talk politics. And also what I love is fascinating. Tell me more. How do you feel about that? So when I talk to a Trump voter, I never try to dissuade them of anything. I just ask them how they feel, what it's like, and what that's like, and what would you like to see happen, and how does that make you feel, and what are you angry about, and how does that feel, and when did you lose trust, and what does that feel like? So um, always watch for this sort of equation of what am I going to achieve if I say X? How do we cope with people who just quote misinformation as fact? Or with people like Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, who just will never admit their theories are wrong? Well, this is very different. Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs are extremely rational agents who make very powerful arguments. And in fact, outside of the issue of Ukraine, they're right about a lot of things. So I wouldn't compare that. I mean, right, if most people in this life had an argument with Mearsheimer in public, they would lose it, right? Mearsheimer would defeat you in an argument, most of the 656 of you, simply because he makes his case very clearly, very robustly, very transparently. He might be wrong, but he makes the case quite well. So I actually think Mearsheimer is really excellent for you to hone your skills on, because he is calm and always analytically transparent and clear. And that's why if you disagree with him, it's quite easy, because he plays the game very fairly. So I don't think there's any problem with Mearsheimer. I haven't enjoyed Jeffrey Sachs's sort of drift on this issue, and how far he's gone into less responsible spaces of our information environment. But I still think he's a perfectly rational actor with whom you could reasonably debate. When you have people just quoting absolute disgraceful falsehoods over and over and over and over and over and over and over, you don't try to dissuade them if you don't feel confident that you can. I mean, I can tell you what my policy is, but my policy is different. It's sort of a policy of a very minor public intellectual. My policy is you can always debate me on the issue, right? So if you, for example, think that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is justified, I'm going to accept that as a reasonable position. I think it's a really egregiously wrong position politically and ethically, but I'm going to accept it. I think it's a reasonable position up for debate. You could argue, for instance, that that's the only way to get to some kind of multipolarity, which is the only way to keep the international system on the road. I think it's a terribly bad argument. You could go in that direction. I'd say, great. What I wouldn't accept is if you started telling me lies like thousands of formal NATO troops for Ukraine, or something false about fascism in Ukraine, or something, that was a glaring factual error. Then I, what I would, what I would do is I wouldn't debate it with you. I would just say no or cool. So I would debate it with you if you said Putin's invasion is justified. I'm happy to debate that. I'd just debate the other side very strongly. But if you tell me a glaring factual error, like that the Earth has 7 moons, I won't debate you on it. And there are a set of issues on which I don't engage in debate. I'll give you an example: human-influenced climate change. I don't engage in debate about that. I don't think that this is something that I want to make the case for, because I think that if you're in a social situation where you have to make the case for it, then already something has gone wrong there. And I appreciate that that means that something's gone wrong in very many social situations. But in the comments, I don't debate climate change. There's a couple of other issues I don't debate. I don't debate, for example, whether neurodiversity is real. There's a lot of people writing in. I got a message the other day saying, I have looked at the physics of it. What physics has to do with it, I have no idea. And I've concluded after my research that neurodiversity doesn't exist. I won't debate that. So there are certain things where I don't, which I won't indulge with a back and forth debate. I'm always open to speak to that person about that position, but it'd be more like, if you would like to hear my perspective on this, here it is. But there won't be debate. So I would say, don't debate established matters of fact. That's the first thing I'm saying. And here's the second thing I'm going to say. Understand that most of the time when people are sort of repetitively factually wrong, the problem isn't that they're factually wrong about the particular thing. The problem is that something has gone epistemically wrong with the way they relate to the world. But if somebody comes to me and says, I don't think human pain is real because I come from a spiritual tradition that says that pain is ephemeral in the end, I am not going to argue back that pain is real by taking somebody to a hospital ward. What I'm going to think is that that person doesn't misunderstand pain. That person misunderstands the difference between illusion and reality. So very often you've got to understand that the issue isn't the factual error, but somebody has got something further back, fundamentally epistemically wrong, that that's the issue. And so if you want to go anywhere with them, it's toward that, right? So when somebody says something about, I don't know, masks, don't debate the masks, debate how one acquires information about certain questions of physics or certain questions of epidemiology and so on. So understand that the issue is most of the time actually further back. Why we Europeans are targeted by both US and Russia. Russia wants our land, US sees the EU as an economic threat. Can we Europeans benefit from US decline. So because I'm only doing emotional questions, I just want to say that where I want to go is to the understanding that there's a global wave of an authoritarian kind that affects Europe and the United States. And in fact, all Putin really is a very extreme version of that wave with a big Russian twist. So understand that. We're all in this together, and the social forces driving a lot of this are global. Wow, I am behind. I'm being really slow. According to Politico, when Trump was asked if he was a narcissist, he said, "I'm not a narcissist. In fact, I'm the least narcissistic person you've ever met." Um, the number one least narcissistic person in the whole world. Well, I hope you look forward to my video. I'm very impressed with what I plan to say in that video about Trump's narcissism. How do you think the general populace of the USA would take a real dictatorship? Could they become like the depoliticized blob in Russia? Yes, easily, very easily. Very, very easily indeed. Don't underestimate how far the difference between Swiss citizens and Russian citizens is social conditions and not culture. It's culture a bit, but it's mostly social conditions. Within a decade, you can pretty much get anybody toward the Russian state, into the Russian state of depoliticization. So easy, very easy. And especially because the global forces here are similar. So that are pushing people to turn away from politics. So you can get there very easily. How would folks in the United States take a real dictatorship? Surprisingly well, in the sense that a dictatorship could establish itself in any European country and sustain itself. Don't have illusions about how rapidly that stuff can get normalized. What I would say is that we're very far away from it because of the resilience of our institutions. We're going to be battering them, but they're going to be pretty impressively resilient. Then there are going to be cultural differences, right? And I think that, you know, in the US population, there are certain propensities to rebellion and taking up arms and so on. And it's not going to work out the same way in every country, but yeah, have no illusions about how easily you can normalize ghastly political arrangements wherever you are, if you're unlucky to have fallen into them. As a fellow East European in the UK, how should you go about engaging your British friends more in activism around the Ukraine war? Well, I don't think that's going to make a big difference. It's just going to make a small difference around the edges, because the big difference is really what states do. But if you wanted more Brits to care about Ukraine, what you'd actually do is try to keep Ukraine out of becoming a political football that polarizes the country. We are still okayish with that in the UK. However, the problem is that we're very pro-Ukrainian, but the intensity of our support for Ukraine is quite low. I mean, the Ukraine issue is probably number 11 or 7 at the highest, as far as national politics issues go. So we're pro-Ukraine, but the intensity isn't quite the same as it is in some of the East European states, the Baltic states, and it's a bit less than in Scandinavia. So I would say that if they are opposed to Ukraine, this is the issue of depolarization that we've already touched on. If they're just a bit apolitical and don't care, what you would do is go in two directions. You can make the humanitarian case or the justice case, but they're probably already familiar and tired of it. So if you want to make the security case, the way you make the security case is you say that Putin will go beyond Ukraine if he's allowed to, but you say that in a non-hysterical way, because Putin is obviously not going to invade Germany. So what you say is that there are certain ways in which Putin could go further, for example, by challenging Article 5 at a very low threshold, and you'd end up having a Russo-Chinese alliance controlling more of the security arrangements in Europe and so on. Andrew, hi Vlad, do you think we're trending toward Russian-style depoliticization as things degrade, or will the future circumstances create more politically active reactions? The global forces that sustain depoliticization are strong. So yes, we are heading in that direction. However, we will also be asked to deal with different types of polarization we haven't encountered yet in the 2030s. And we may need to resist genuine onset of authoritarianism in some Western countries. And there could be significant mobilizations of citizens. So we're nowhere near as bad as the Russians. And I think there are some cultural reasons why they're as bad as they are. But the less cultural, the more sociological reasons we share, quite frankly. And we are prone to the same political disease. Now, what I think will be happening in the 2030s is that we're going to be dealing with more and more exclusionary politics. And I think the climate crisis will exacerbate that. And we're going to see new forms of, unfortunately, white identitarian politics in the 2030s that we're not quite seeing yet, not very directly. So we'll need to see how far we can challenge that. But the problem is that a lot of forms of mobilization are dependent on the capacity of a democracy to have a national conversation. And we're struggling with a national conversation. So the best thing we can do for now is to try to resuscitate our capacity to have a conversation at the table of politics with all of our citizens, as opposed to just floating around in our bubbles. So we're far away from Russia, but is the trend toward more depoliticization? Yes. The crisis of trust that we're facing in institutions, the propensity to give up trust in institutions will increase. Rachel, hi. How do you cope with people who insist my favorite candidate didn't fail, she was failed by the people, and this situation is their fault? Well, it just depends on obviously whether you have any sympathy with that case, as I don't, for example, with Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden literally thinks that he would have probably won. I think that's an extraordinary thought, but that's what power does to you. It can corrupt you epistemically. So you basically think about, in the US case, whether a particular candidate for office was able to speak to stressed, busy, working class Americans, wherever they are and whatever their race. One of the biggest tests at the moment is this business that I'm always obsessed about, which is solidarity, a capacity to speak to the country, right? And here you might just fill that out with whatever you want to put in its place. I think I know you would want to put some economic populism in its place as one of the things you want to have there. And I think you're right about that. So you know, was my candidate an economic populist in some ways? You know, if they weren't, then that's a problem. Did they, you know, perpetuate the alienation of the majority of the population from the way they perceive the privileged, credentialed class or not? You know, so that's what you do. And of course, you just also see if the people fit the job. And one of the things with Kamala Harris is she didn't fit the job. She wasn't a national leader. We were very ambitiously, constructively trying to have a conversation about what she needed to do and change to be stronger. But there we go. Oh, Rachel, I've misunderstood your question because of my brain fog. The people were wrong not to vote for my candidate. Okay, now I understand what you're saying. So the US people failed Kamala Harris. I would be indignant about that, and I would say that's kind of demophobic, anti-democratic. You have to understand that I think fundamentally what goes wrong with that thought is the idea that you can make an intellectual mistake in politics, but politics isn't an argument. It's possible that Trump voters, for example, are having a reasonable reaction politically and voting for Trump. That what they're doing is understandable and reasonable and proportionate, and that they're misinformed. The two are not incompatible. In fact, they often go together. If you think that certain circumstances lead people to think almost psychotically and give up on reality because their circumstances are difficult. Their economic circumstances are difficult. Their political circumstances are difficult. So they just destroy reality in their heads. That's completely understandable. So it's demophobia, it's voter shaming. It's really, 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 really bad. And you always have to put political candidates through a kind of a doorstep test. How would they do on the doorstep with a challenging citizen who doesn't support them? What would they have to say? So I'm always inclined to take the side of voters and to realize that very often wildly delusional voters about many matters of fact, for instance, can be decent, can be hardworking, and in fact can be reasonable, right? I mean, because their institutions are failing them in many ways. They don't know how to react to that, so they press a kind of button that seems to be the button you press when your institutions are failing you. And then the situation gets so hard that you feel like you begin giving up on reality. That's also reasonable. It means your views become less truthful, but it's a reasonable reaction. So that's the kind of litmus test I use for voters. You don't test them on whether you don't test, whether they're legit on the basis of whether they've got all the reality right. You test them on whether they're legit because their position is reasonable. That's to say, what they feel is understandable. What they've done, they've thought about a little bit, and so on and so forth. So be very, very fast to be skeptical of their argument, robustly oppose it, and then say that it's the kind of argument that makes you lose elections and eventually makes you lose your democracy too, because you lose contact with your citizens. Alexandra, what's your take on the unholy alliance between Russian Zeds, MAGA, and the far right in Romania? People supporting the far right seem to think Musk, Vance, and Putin are their saviors from the EU. So, just like there are global social forces driving some of the authoritarian wave we're seeing all over the world, so there are internet bubbles where millions upon millions of people congregate and arrive at certain views. This is very, very algorithm driven. And therefore, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that some of the memes and talking points and slogans are the same, and some of the heroes are the same. Um, what I would tend to do in my reaction to this is I would see it as more organic rather than contrived, as contrived as it is, and it is very contrived. You've got Musk interfering in the political affairs of other countries. It's very contrived, but understand that it's also organic and more organic than contrived, and that algorithms play a very big part. And that's why we've got this weird situation. Yeah, you can meet somebody down the street, in Prague, and they are saying the same stuff that somebody's saying in Texas. And that's weird. Well, they're in the same internet bubble. Rachel saying, never debate race, science. Is there any possibility of Russia becoming a democracy after Putin? No hope at all. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible. I mean, let me put it like this. It's conceivable that in 2050, Russia will be a democracy and Ukraine and France won't be. It's completely conceivable. History plays funny tricks on us. I wouldn't bet on that. I'd bet against that pretty strongly. But it's possible. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. If you want a kind of a clue of how I'd see it, I'd put it in low double digits. ALS, thank you. Gazer, can Europe really stand up against US and Russia? What role could China get? Can't go there today because we're talking emotions. Life doesn't feel very safe at the moment. Your take on that? My take on that is that the world is becoming a carousel. So I'm trying to answer your question emotionally and sort of touch on the political analysis indirectly. The world is becoming a kind of a carousel of friends and enemies in certain respects. We've been talking about that phrase and that word frenemies for a year or two now on the channels. And look at how you're seeing it with the US and Ukraine now, right? An ally, but also a vassal state to be treated for extractive purposes. Same with the Russians. They're an enemy, but Trump's also being friendly with Russia at the same time in other respects. So we're in a carousel of relations of friends and enemies in certain respects, which means that alliances are either absent or fleeting, and that hard power decides more than soft power does now in this new world. And relationships are more complex and less reliable, and there's no longer as much space for such a thing as being a proper ally in most major respects. That's a sort of relationship that's sort of slowly going out of the window, and Trump is accelerating that demise. So that's a little bit of what I'd say. It's a world of friends and enemies in certain respects, and it's a world where we're transitioning from soft power to hard power, deciding, even in the West. And the way to deal with this is to just be very gentle and try to acclimatize and realize that we are just resetting into a 19th century sort of politics, which is not great, but it's not the same as a giant meteorite hitting the Earth. There's a lot more. It's a wonderful question, but I'm sure we'll keep coming back. Please share your thoughts on things to keep faith for this February. Well, look, there was a peaceful transition of power in the United States when Trump returned. I think that's very good and very impressive and worth noting. Western democracies overwhelmingly will survive for years to come. Life for people in the West will remain privileged and stable for the foreseeable future. Ukraine has a strong chance of remaining politically independent of Russia. A lot of the political diseases we're facing have partial solutions that are up to us. So when I say that there's a trajectory of democratic decline, the rate of that trajectory can vary enormously depending on what we do. So there's a room for action that makes a very significant difference to where we land. Mario, how can you hold a society responsible for antisocial political systems? Impossible to punish ordinary Russians. Here I make a very simple distinction between blame and responsibility. All Americans are responsible for Donald Trump. All Russians are responsible for Vladimir Putin. But Americans are not blameworthy for Trump. They're not guilty for Trump. And Russians are not guilty for Putin, or guilty and blameworthy for Putin. So the difference is that we're distinguishing really, in fact, guilt and responsibility. Guilt goes with the idea of blame. Responsibility is a blameless form of ethical implicature. How do you cope with when people hate you or shun, label, and cancel you because of something you said or a view expressed? Well, because my audience is overwhelmingly Western, I have got very little blowback from Russians or Ukrainians. I have probably got a ratio of about 50 to 1. 50 to 1 in terms of Russians making mean comments versus Ukrainians making mean comments, right? Some Ukrainians are going to think that I'm a Russian and I'm in favor of some kind of Russian imperialism because I don't think Russia is likely to break up anytime soon, something like that. But I get almost no comments like that. Almost all comments I get from Ukrainians are positive, and most of the comments I get from Russians are positive. But it's still, well, if it's, you accept that it's really tiny, then the majority is the majority of this tiny number of negative comments are coming from Russians. Now there's more Trump folks coming through, Trump folks who bot-like in their behavior. In terms of cancellation, what really happens is sometimes people mass report a video, and unfortunately that puts the channels at risk sometimes. So that's the reality you face. So funnily enough, in the safety of a London living room, there's a kind of a precarity to having a political YouTube channel, even though it's not an activist channel, it's an analysis channels and reassurance channel today. But it's fragile. This stuff is fragile, and some kind of silly slip by YouTube can make you lose the channel. So yeah, that's this issue of mass reporting. I haven't had many problems with hyper identity politics. Only once or twice have people freaked out at me on the basis of my criticisms of wokeism. But I increasingly have no tolerance for that because it's just such a political dead end. So it's precarious. How does it affect me emotionally? Well, when people try to be mean to me, it has no effect on me. I often wonder what their mental health is like and how they're doing. And you've got to understand that, right? When somebody is saying, you are a disgrace and you should be jailed, I'm going to report your video. Think about what are they doing? Like, would you ever write that to somebody? Would I ever write that? No, I wouldn't. And if I did, what would I think? I would think that my mental health is really bad if I ever wrote that to somebody. So you've got to empathize, right? That's not a comment produced by happiness. So when I get abuse, I normally have empathy. But if I have any sort of element of stress relative to my health issues, obviously it's low. My level of stress about the YouTube channels, my level of stress about my health issues is high. But if I do have any level of stress about being cancelled, it's this business of the fact that YouTube can, in virtue of making some kind of mistake, just take away a channel because some silly Russian bots reported it. So that's possible and always a risk, and I'm conscious of that. I would say I'm conscious of that probably a couple of times a week. Green tea. In London, I recommend Postcard Teas. They import the best artisanal teas. This is a sencha that's in this glass. But I'm more a coffee person than a tea person. How to deal with the anxiety of unstable populist morons having nuclear weapons? Understand that the risk is higher, but it's low. But it's higher. That's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is that nuclear war doesn't happen overnight. So if there is going to be a nuclear war between Russia and the United States, it will not happen next Tuesday. It will likely be a process of escalation that takes some time, to which you will be able to react. Now, not that you'll be able to do much about it, but what I'm saying is that this is not something that's just going to happen out of the blue. Then there needs to be a series of developments which you won't miss. So if you're worried about just waking up to it tomorrow, then don't worry about that. If you're worried about the chances of it being increased, then yes. I mean, as Anders Buck-Nielsen argued in a recent video, just the destabilization of the international order Trump has generated, the fact that Trump has largely decimated Article 5 in a matter of weeks, because quite frankly now, you can't expect America to stand up for the Baltics if Russia invaded them in a couple of years. And by invasion, I don't mean a full-scale invasion, I mean some kind of provocation and so on. So that's a more dangerous world, because everything is destabilized. The arrangement of deterrence is destabilized. But you also have to then recognize that there's no way to be 100% safe in life, and that what you're really talking about is a very, very small risk becoming not very, very small, but very small. So you've lost one very there, and that's really the reality. But we have to work toward new global arrangements, and we'll see how that works out for us. As Canadians, how do we manage the existential threat now being put on our nation? How do we manage the reality we might lose our sovereignty or worse? You are in many ways the vulnerable neighbor in that relationship, because your neighbor to the south is much bigger. It's dependent on you in some ways, but you're more dependent on it. You can't assume that Trump will be followed by a renormalization, because he won't be, even if he is, right? If you get a younger version of Joe Biden replacing Trump, there's going to be a more Trumpian Trump in the 2030s, plausibly. So it's over. The stability that was present before, it's permanently over, even if there's a very different president after Trump. It doesn't make you feel comfortable, especially as Canada itself might be sliding toward populist authoritarianism too over the next 10, 15 years. What I would say is that for now, you're not facing an actual danger of invasion. You're not facing an actual danger of losing your sovereignty. Trump is doing politics and setting out a very extreme position to see what benefits might fall his way as a result of staking out such an extreme position. So you've got to take it seriously, but I don't think you put the emphasis on taking it literally. But you now focus on alliances with other countries around the world that are your siblings now, that are your brothers and sisters. They're facing the same kind of abandonment and destabilization from the United States. So it's very, very disconcerting. But it's also important to not over excessively panic about this being a literal and imminent threat. Brian, what attitude should I have toward people with atrocious political beliefs when I can't speak honestly with them? Don't discuss politics with them. Co-workers, clients, all kinds of people. Don't discuss politics with them. But also know that sometimes it's okay to just lose your shit and say, screw you, this is what I think, and your views are disgraceful. So, there's places you don't want to go. Probably you should deploy boundaries to protect yourself from floating into political waters that are not going to be constructive. So always think, what am I going to get out of this, right? Don't be a sort of a truth missionary. It's not going to be effective. Don't try to persuade people unless you have very special reason to think they're going to be persuaded. If you do discuss not with the view of debating or persuading, but with the view of sharing. How do you feel? Well, I think actually I have a very high view of Trump. Well, you have a very high view of Trump. I actually have a very low view of Trump. It's interesting. We have different views here. So I like political discussion as mapping. You map each other, but you don't debate, you don't compete, but you also talk about shared concerns, shared fears. But it might become impossible if they're telling you 17 factually wrong things a minute. Then you can't go there. And I appreciate this is very difficult in the workplace. And I appreciate you may not be able to change your workplace, even though this is difficult. And that's why I think boundaries can be important. I think sometimes it's just right to say, in my work environment, I am not going to say that I think that Trump is a complete disaster. So that may be the right thing to do, right? You don't want to take your political views somewhere where they have no way of being constructively received, right? So don't try to serve a tennis serve if there isn't a tennis court on the other side of the net. Don't do that. but it's not, it's hard. It's not easy, because they might be talking politics at you all the time, and you might say, look, I respect you, would you be open if we set a slight boundary here whereby there's certain things we don't talk about, you know um, one of the things I especially don't like is politics chit chat. um, if you're going to do it in a proper conversation about it that has time to evolve, when you're having a coffee or having a beer. What I don't like is, as you go about at work, a political remark here, a political remark there, you know? Um, that I find quite difficult, quite toxic. Um, but I do think it's appropriate, you know, um, at this time, to sometimes set political boundaries at work. And you can do it very respectfully. Look, we're a very divided country, we have very different feelings, but we're patriotic. We love our country, but we have different views, different feelings. So sometimes I think it's nice for us to focus on relating constructively and not touch on certain topics. Would you be open to that? Um, well, and if you're not, then I'm afraid I'm going to set this boundary. So I'm just not going to go there when you raise certain things. Let me tell you that. But it's hard, and I might talk about it more because I think this is an ongoing issue. Christopher, um, I always feel kind of dim until I listen to anyone around me speak at all, and then presumably you don't feel dim. How do I not feel superior when it feels I'm surrounded by adult children? So distinguish between people being um, intellectually kind of sloppy and people freaking out and losing their sense of reality. Um, and there you have to have compassion until it very negatively affects you, right? So what am I doing with this community? I'm saying, look, um, a lot of Trump voters have lost a sense of reality. Not all Trump voters. A lot of Trump voters have a reasonable sense of reality. They're not completely factually misinformed. But there's an important core of the Trump vote that is engaged in what I would call a psychotic pattern of thought, where you just give up on reality. And I'm saying that that's fairly proportionate, quite understandable, in many ways caused by the sorts of politics they've been exposed to. And I am inviting empathy and compassion and imagination there from you, because if you don't do that, you'll be a hypocrite when you criticize them, because they are delusional about Trump, but you're delusional about them. Not saying you're delusional about them, but I'm saying hypothetically, right, we in this community are at risk of being unimaginative and solipsistic in the way we think of Trump voters, right? But it's equivalent, right? The amount of magical thinking that's here in the anti-Trump bubble is not far below the amount of magical thinking in the Trump bubble. It's just different kinds of magical thinking directed toward different things, right? But the amount of magical thinking comments I get under my chats about Trump is really high, right? And I try to be compassionate about that, but you got to be compassionate about the, stuff on the other side. What you don't want to be is somebody who has wet themselves, has no idea they've wet themselves, a complete denial about the fact that you've wet yourself, and you're laughing and mocking the other side across the fence for wetting themselves. You don't want to be politically in that predicament. It's unconstructive for your democracy. Mika saying, does Russia see our 1930s like salutes as a threat? No. They see them as a renormalization of global affairs toward the sort of shape they want them to take. MAGA engages in performative politics. Yes. Theater is more important than the thing itself often. Are we overreacting to the performance? Yes. Not in the sense that we think that the performance is really horrific and we should be okay with it, but in the sense that you don't want to treat Trump as though he is something he is not. So one of the risks here is, for instance, not to clearly see him as a post-truth populist. We've seen that recently when he's taken a slightly different tack on the issue of who started the war, right? It's not that he changed his mind from one day to the next and then went on to say, well, it's Russia who started it. It's that is part of the normal post-truth carousel he engages in. But a lot of the reporting about it has been, oh, Trump has backtracked. No, he hasn't backtracked on anything. This is the carousel. So it's important to see the performance for what it is. And so here, actually, I've given you an example of how we're reacting to the performance as though it wasn't a performance when it is. And I do think that what you have to do is keep in mind that you've got to worry about the political projects they're engaged in. Are they attacking the civil service? Are they attacking the media? Rather than follow every little thing that's thrown out into the informational environment, because you've got to understand that some of the purpose of what they're doing is actually to distract you via a saturation, which is a Russian propaganda tactic too, a saturation of the informational environment. You don't want to react, as a sort of a gullible, misdirected citizen to this maneuver of the saturation of the informational environment. So no, you don't want to end up debating in detail, one of 77 comments Trump's made. You've got to see, what are they doing politically? What's the power what are the power moves there? And what are we really worried about? So you've got to understand that there are theatrics here, and especially with Trump's narcissism, the world is just cartoons and theatrics for him. And you don't want to overreact to that, either by getting caught up on it or by misunderstanding the theatrics as some legitimate sort of alteration of position or whatever, which it isn't. But then you want to keep an eye on what they are basically doing. And the key question to ask there is, are they trying to undermine counter-majoritarian institutions, power that's there to check power, to keep democracy on the road? So yeah, you've got to not react to the wave of post-truth saturation of the information environment, unless it's part of a pattern you're watchful of and are trying to be alert to. I keep thinking about what could have been done to prevent democratic decline, Trump and Putin. Is this unhelpful thinking? No, it's really helpful, but you've got to project it forward. So what are we going to do now, right? So we've got to understand that a modicum of economic populism might be necessary. We've got to understand that hyperidentity politics is BS. We've got to put it behind. We've got to understand that lots of people are feeling deep economic fear and exclusion. You've got to understand people who've lost trust in various ways, but in democratic institutions, blah, 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 blah. You've got to explore ways of re-energizing your democracy with perhaps new local level democratic institutions that supplement national level democratic institutions or state level democratic institutions. So yes, there's a process of a kind of quasi neoliberal technocratic centrism that helped us get here. But you think about it having got us in the wrong direction, not because you're desperate to go into the past and change it, but because for one, we know that more of the same won't do. So I always say, right, the critiques of Trump that just offer the option of a sort of renormalization back into a kind of technocratic center, that's a terrible idea, terrible politics. So you just got to learn from what we the trends, the tendencies we were on in the past, how we avoid perpetuating them in the future to minimize the democratic slide that we are on. So just convert the critique of the past into your sense of the immediate future, 5 to 10 years ahead. Living through the public health crisis and through climate change in college made me antagonistic to all conservative ideologies, not just our current popular wave. I believe the rot really comes with Edmund Burke. Well, Edmund Burke is a great political thinker, so I don't think he's the instigation of a rot. I don't think you can say that ideologies that aren't yours are rotten. Ideologies can't be clearly separated from each other. That's to say, you're a conservative in some respects, right? So there's no such thing as a definition of a socialist or a liberal or a conservative that completely keeps out all of the other two ideologies. It's fluid, it's quite messy. And there are constructive and destructive versions of these ideologies. They're always alive, always liable to being reinterpreted. But what you watch for today, which is why I think politically, I think it's important to challenge your thought. What you watch for today are um, constitutional conservatives who believe in counter-majoritarian institutions on the one hand, versus ex-conservatives or post-conservatives like J.D. Vance, who, to a degree, want to smash democratic institutions. Daniel, how could this era of democratic decline end, and how would we know? So when it ends, it's not going to convert into a reversion of where we came from. That's the recency prejudice, the prejudice of the recent past. So it's not that it's going to last 20 years and you'll get back to 1999. That is over. That's not going to come back. It was an unusually positive period, but you're not going to have that period exactly. If you're going to have a positive period in the future, it won't look anything like it anyway. And I don't think a very positive period in the future is going to come this century. But that's not to say that there isn't going to be stable and fairly safe life in the West for decades to come. Where are we going to land? We're going to land with a situation where some Western democracies may survive and persist, and others may slowly collapse or slowly degrade, rather. And I put a very silly stat on it, which is not a real stat; it's just a psychological clue that I sometimes use, and that's that I expect 3/4 of Western democracies to survive into the late, let's say, 2030s. So sort of a 1 in 4 failure rate. That's kind of what we are on course for, and we can do worse or we can do better, and we should try to do better, because it could be your democracy that's on the bubble, can go one way or another, and it'll make all the difference in the world to save it. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the general chat for a little bit and see how we're doing. Yeah. Dudok, I hope to be wrong about many of the things I'm saying. I'd love to be wrong. No, Vance is not Trump's lapdog. Vance has much clearer political ideas and principles than Trump. It's Trump who doesn't believe anything. Vance is able to systematically think about what kind of political project he's hoping to be part of after Trump goes. So Vance is thinking very clearly about politics, and he actually is more in touch with reality politically than Kamala Harris, for instance. So that makes him a dangerous actor because he has recently chosen to be entrepreneurial and irresponsible by jumping on the Trump bandwagon. Hi Vlad, some time ago I asked on when hope is lost and your mic stopped working. I'm gay in a brutally repressive Middle Eastern country. Jesus Christ. There are some places in the world where it's really not good to be gay. The principle for hope is very simple for me. It's can you tell a truthful story about the future that doesn't lead to despair? And if that's the case, then you've got hope. Hope is not optimism. Optimism is more dispositional. Hope is more to do with a truthful relationship with the world, and also with faith. So the truthful relationship with the world bit is about are the sorts of stories that I'm telling about where I think the world is going, stories that give me some hope, or do they just generate despair? And if I tell a story that's hopeful, can it be truthful, or do I have to make the story bullshitty for it to be hopeful? So that's the truthfulness bit. The faith bit is, really about walking into an uncertain future, where you are not sure how you're gonna get the things you want to get, but you also know that the how could become clear and possible later, but at this point you just don't know it, and so you're walking into the future, you know where you hope to get answers, but you don't have any sense what shape they might be yet. You don't see them yet, and that's really difficult because you're walking into a bit of a sort of a black space. So that's in principle how I think about hope. Look, I think that we're in a world where gay rights is an oscillating issue. There are countries that are going to be making progress on it, and there are going to be countries that are actually regressing on it. And sometimes it'll happen as expected, but sometimes we'll be surprised in the positive and in the negative direction. I also think that it's very important not to be alone. It's very important to associate with other gay people, and of course associate with gay people who are facing the predicament that you're facing. So that kind of solidarity, that kind of group solidarity, is really, really significant. Some kind of blinded Trump bot might tell me I'm doing hyper identity politics when I say that. Not at all. Not at all. I'm doing constructive identity politics. So associating with others who are facing what you're facing and who understand is very, 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 very important. But also, of course, one of the most toxic things, and here I can just give you empathy, is not being transparent, right? So negotiating a world where you can't share freely what you are is inherently stressful, because non-transparency is inherently stressful to us human beings. Hey Vlad, I'm 22. Hi little person. and I am from Finland. I'm in the army reserves. Do you think I'll have to fight for my country during my life? Will the Russian threat increase or decrease? So the Russian threat will increase over the years to come. If you are asking me, it'd be quite irresponsible to give any definite answer, but the way you should think about it is probably not. Probably not. Here is how I view this. I do think Russia is on course to challenge Article 5. But three things can happen. First of all, there might be nothing to challenge. And Russia is not interested in territorial conquest. You see, Russia has no interest in conquering territory. Russia has interest in reshaping international affairs. So Article 5 could just collapse. There's nothing for Putin to challenge. And we're halfway there in the last few weeks. One. Two, if Putin challenges Article 5, he won't necessarily do it with a full-scale invasion, where he doesn't have the capacity for that. It'll be some kind of a hybrid low-threshold challenge. Two. And three, even if he's on course to do that, history is limitlessly unpredictable and throws curveballs. Curveballs are kind of normal in history. And so a few curveballs might come up and Putin won't have the time or the space or, the resources to do this. So you put all of that into the mixer, the answer is no, on balance, as a reasonable expectation. But it's not a confident no, it's a probably not. Pat, I'm not sure I'm getting your question. How do you feel when you're living in the plot of a movie where bad guys are clearly the bad guys, but you're saying presumably not recognized as the bad guys? That's life. That's life. And it just wasn't as much the case in recent history. And it's a shock. If you feel that wasn't happening before and now is happening, it's a shock. And then we're back to that period of having to adjust. Rachel is recommending Curtis Yarvin. I'm sometimes invited, I haven't gone for health reasons. I'm sometimes invited to a podcast where Curtis Yarvin seems to be a regular. So it's not inconceivable that I might talk to him at some point. But yeah, I mean, the Curtis Yarvin story is profoundly sort of infantilized. It's the political ideology of children. It's a profoundly unserious proposal, but more about that another time. Will the right end up aligned or opposed to Russia? The right will get progressively aligned with Russia because the constitutional right opposes Russia. The X-right, the post-conservative, anti-constitutional right, tends to align itself with Russia, unfortunately, more. Mark is saying, I have a political question. Why do people only reply if I say something provocative? Costa is asking us to talk about Serbia, which is very important, but I want to keep it on the emotional side today, if that's okay. We might get there. Life of Bob is also asking important political questions, but I might stick to my emotional agenda. And actually, you know what? Let's begin gently winding down. Let's say 5 more minutes to take us to 1:45. Vlad, I know that you know Benjamin Boyce. Would you consider appearing on his channel? I like his approach to debate and conversation, but his politics might be in the wrong direction. I don't have any problem. So yes, absolutely, absolutely. I have no problem with talking to anybody as long as they will not be consciously manipulative in the conversation via the deployment of slogans, which happens a lot. And in that sense, I won't participate in the conversation. Some conversations are difficult to have because they require a lot. I mean, for example, talking to Jordan Peterson requires charisma. That's why, for instance, when the conversation that Destiny had with Jordan rather dominated it. So different conversations have different needs, and they need to fit. They need to fit the criteria. So and that wouldn't be the case with Benjamin Boyce. I haven't followed what he feels. I mean, whether he supports Trump at the moment or not, I don't know. I spoke to him briefly on an application called Clubhouse a few years ago, which was a sort of a thing. I used to do a philosophy reading on Clubhouse before I was on YouTube. And that's an app that mostly sort of died, but was very popular for a while during the early 2020s. So there we go. So yes, the answer is yes. Attila is asking good political questions, but I think we're trying to be... Rachel's saying talking to Jordan Peterson requires drugs. Talking to Jordan Peterson would require charisma. So, for instance, I'd be worried about talking to Jordan Peterson for an obvious reason, that my channels might get flooded with, folks who are going to disrupt the community. And Jordan is in many ways sort of naughty and manipulative, I think, in how he interacts with the information environment. With me, if I spoke to Jordan Peterson, it would need to be when I am not feeling too physically ill, because I would need to be able to express my charisma a little bit. And if I did, then I would be in charge of that conversation, actually. And actually, Jordan would allow me to be in charge of that conversation, because he perceives he's still, even though he is very confident and bullish and very well practiced, he still perceives exceptional intelligence that exceeds his own when it's in his presence, which is a quality of his. So, but if I'm really sick, I couldn't quite do that if I'm feeling a lot of physical symptoms. So that'd be my way up. But nobody's asked me, so it's not an issue. But as I say, also, in these terrible algorithmic bubbles, it's also dangerous for people to speak to each other, because, quite seriously, if I go on some big, channel and I have an argument with somebody, discussion with somebody who thinks that Trump is good for democracy, uh, just 10,000 people coming over to the channels with a very different view could completely redirect us algorithmically and run us aground. So I'm always going to be very conservative about protecting the community when I make decisions like that. Eric is talking about Ian McGilchrist. I think Ian McGilchrist is a friend of a friend. And interestingly, when Ian McGilchrist spoke to Jordan Peterson, Jordan was ceding ground to him and being a bit insecure and a bit conscious of Ian's intelligence. So it speaks back to the example, to the point I was trying to make earlier. So basically, because I'm a really useless psychology tip person, all I've just said is you're going to freak out for 18 months or 24 months and then it'll be easier. So I haven't solved any problems. But I'll keep trying, and I'll keep trying to do better. And today, partly because my health was a bit less, I thought we'd just do a personal conversation. Have we? You see, the main channel has been stuck on 180,000 for a long time because I am sick and not making videos. Because this got to 100 now. Yes, beautiful community, you are at the 100,000 threshold on chat. So we're just beginning, and it's all very lovely. It's all very lovely. So thank you so much for tolerating my semi-melted down brain today. And we're going to be back on the main channel in a probably on Tuesday, hopefully. So we will see. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody who was with me for this lovely, lovely Sunday live. We're entering a transitional moment. We're just at the beginning of a transitional moment. So this is not meant to be easy. And it's humans across history have freaked out when transitional moments have happened. So this is genuinely difficult. And some of the most smart and powerful people are feeling quite lost. So you're very much not, you're very much not alone, and it's not in any way a failure to feel like that. It's completely understandable, and we're here to sort of work through it. Big gratitude, and bye for now. Lots of love.